Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Backlog Banter. My name is Tucker Hazel. I am joined by my underwhelmed co-host, Abram Beener, and today we're here to talk about why you click on this video, Abram's thoughts, and presumably not very much excitement for the sequel to Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, as it's so tentatively called. We don't know very much about this game, but we are excited to talk about it, and if you want to talk to us about this game or anything else at all, you can join our Discord. Link is in the description. Of course, you can like and subscribe. Do those for me, and I will give you a little peck on the cheek. But Abram, thank you very much for joining me today.
You're
welcome.
welcome.
Give him a round of applause, little snaps, little claps. Abram, tell me why the sequel to Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is not very exciting to you.
Because it's dumb.
All right, boys, we're out and we're out of here.
No. In all honesty, I think the sequel to Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, as it's officially titled, and I will continue to call it that for the remainder of this video. It's just
it is the most official name that we have.
Yes,
which is fucking stupid.
I think that I think it is just a game releasing at the wrong time.
Interesting. Okay.
My feeling about Breath of the Wild is this: Breath of the Wild works because it is very under-designed. It's a game that is basically entirely predicated on you going out into Hyrule and experiencing its physics engine, experiencing the joy of exploring, of understanding how to climb, of reaching the top of a mountain and sliding back down it on your shield, right?
Yeah.
It's not a Zelda game that is successful because of its narrative, because of its dungeons, because of the traditional puzzles. The things that make a traditional Zelda game great, Breath of the Wild doesn't really have.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that makes it bad. I think it actually makes it one of the most interesting games Nintendo's ever released. But I don't think you can do that twice. Yeah. I can't step out onto the Great Plateau a second time and feel the way I did the first time.
Sure.
And because of that, I just don't think that, particularly when 6 years have passed between Breath of the Wild 1 and Breath of the Wild 2, which is the development cycle of a new 3D Zelda, I don't think the idea of a Majora's Mask sequel to Breath of the Wild for me works.
Yeah.
Because the premise of Breath of the Wild is that Breath of the Wild must be a standalone experience. There's a reason why people say if I could go back in time, erase one game from my memory and play it again for the first time in Breath of the Wild.
Yeah.
Because you can't love Breath of the Wild twice.
Yes.
I just don't think you can do that.
It's interesting you say that because honestly, I entirely agree. Everything you said there is exactly my frame of mind as well. However, I think the caveat and why I think we're coming from a little bit different angles on this is I think Nintendo knows that as well. And I think because of that, I think there's something here that is obviously we don't know yet because we don't know a ton about the game that they're holding back that will cause that change in how we're approaching this game, how we're thinking of a sequel to Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, not as something that's trying to exactly recapture that energy, but reframe it in an interesting way and maybe recombine it into something that it could even be more special, more unique. Not necessarily more special because, let me rephrase that. Not more special, more unique, because I don't think that it's really possible to recapture that, as Breath of the Wild is one of the most unique and special Zelda games in the long-running franchise, but something that is able to take the spirit and energy in game design and combine it with what worked with the puzzles and combat and world design and progression of the older games and make something that is hopefully the best of both worlds. And I think the fact that we haven't seen very much yet actually in some ways gives me a lot of hope that there is something that they're hiding that'll make this clearly very exciting. But the fact that they're hiding it is also really strange. We don't know the fucking name of the goddamn video game. We don't know its release window. It's all a lot of frustrating lack of information. But yeah, it's crazy that we thought, okay, this is the Breath of the Wild. This is the Majora's Mask to Breath of the Wild.
Yeah.
But that released a year after Ocarina of Time, or 2 years. One of the two.
Yeah, it's very close. That's the point. It's like 18 months or so.
In a very truncated development cycle. This is a normal development cycle. But I think the game will be better for that, and I think that there is an excitement there that still percolates because I think Nintendo also realizes they can't just do the same thing again.
I mean, I'm of two minds of this because I think you're definitely, the optimistic part of me wants to say that you're right, but as you were saying, we have so little to go off of, and so when I look at that trailer from E3, which was from this year, which is the first like gameplay look at the experience that we've gotten, it is a lot of the same Breath of the Wild things.
Yes.
Of discovery, of using of using stasis to shoot like those balls back at the Lizalfos, and going through the bottom of the platform to the top is a really interesting idea, but it's another traversal option. It just everything there, on top of the fact that it's reusing so much of the map and seemingly like building a new map above it with these sort of like pretty clearly Skyward Sword narratively related islands or things. To me, that just feels like they're making Breath of the Wild plus. And being the cynical fool I am, when you say that they feel like they can't do the same thing again, I hope that's true. But what I'm concerned about is that they say, well, let's do that same thing again because it got us Game of the Year, but let's add more to it.
Sure.
And my thing is just that Breath of the Wild's core, at its very core, doesn't work twice. So even if you add in this new like above the Hyrule area and these new like fucking Guiji powers, ultimately it's the Champions Ballad. It's a $60 Champions Ballad where more Breath of the Wild is great, but more Breath of the Wild is more Breath of the Wild, right?
Sure.
And that's just my concern, because Majora's Mask was a complete inversion of what Ocarina was. And this just, from what we've seen, of course, that's the asterisk, what we've seen doesn't suggest that to me.
No, that is a great point. I think that that trailer speaks both things equally to me.
Yeah,
it speaks, okay, yes, this is clearly still trying to give us the same vibes of discovery and exploration and openness that Breath of the Wild did.
Yeah.
But there's only like 30 seconds of footage.
Right.
And it only being 30 seconds footage, and that being the only thing we've seen in this game that has a normal length development cycle, makes me wonder what are they doing for the last 6 years? There has to be something else. They already made Breath of the Wild. If they're doing Breath of the Wild Plus, why didn't this release 2 years ago, 3 years ago? I really think it could have, if it was going to be just them only adding on top of it. But I do think there is a possible reframing that they're using this not extended but normal development cycle to work on. I think that there's probably something hiding because we haven't seen that much.
I certainly hope you're right, but ultimately I can't say any more than that because we haven't seen it. And I think that's the other thing that's given me a lot of pause.
Sure.
Because you're totally right. This game should have released in 2019, or early 2020, right? Before because of course the pandemic hits, it fucks up Japanese game development. I totally get that. But that doesn't change the fact that the game probably should have been out before any of that really went down.
Yeah.
So it makes me feel like either they took a big break, which is totally understandable, but if you're gonna take a big break, I don't think you can redo that same thing. Regardless of the factors that transpired, the time has passed, It will be 5 years by the time Breath of the Wild's sequel releases.
Yeah.
And why? Why are you telling us that the name is a spoiler so you can't give us a sequel, but it's on official promotional infographics as the sequel to Breath of the Wild? That's what it's called in the Game Awards, the most anticipated game nomination.
Yeah.
Why can't you tell us anything? Because you're not communicating to me that you have anything worth hiding.
True, yeah.
Yeah. It's like, okay, there's going to be a bigger narrative focus, clearly. But Breath of the Wild, or just Zelda as a whole, is not successful because of its narrative, I don't think. It's successful because of its world building and its characters, but not necessarily its lore. The construction of the Breath of the Zelda lore has been a complete retroactive fabrication for the Hyrule Historia's release, right? That's not what the series is built upon. Now, there are, of course, the people who love Zelda for the lore, but they're a fraction of the player base. So if the conceit here is new gameplay additions and a story, a real story, opposed to sort of the backgrounded traditional narrative in Breath of the Wild, I just don't think that's enough.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because I would say I disagree to an extent, because I think the biggest complaint, though, of course, Breath of the Wild, 199 on Metacritic, literally Game of the Year, one of the most influential and important games of this generation, still had people complaining that the story was very lacking in Breath of the Wild. That was the biggest complaint about that game, is that the narrative wasn't very strong. That also combined with the weird voice acting that they'd never done before, so it felt a little bit off. I do think with the development experience and greater focus on narrative could bring us something very, from this perspective, very unique for the Zelda franchise. Sure. Placing focus on a narrative in that open world that they already have designed could make for something very special. And I think that that also puts them on an interesting new direction of trying to focus on story. You're right that the people who care about the lore primarily are a small subsect, but I do think there could be it could be more of a subsect of Zelda fans that care about this. And I do think them putting effort somewhere else is interesting and kind of combats the idea that this is just more of the same. If it is focused on narrative, okay, then that's why this game exists. That's why it's a unique Zelda game. Is they're putting this effort into story, which of course we don't know for sure, but that seems what they're hinting at.
It seems likely.
And I think that could be the kind of cure to what you're thinking of it just being Breath of the Wild Plus. It's not just Breath of the Wild Plus, it's a different kind of Breath of the Wild with a focus on story. I think it could be really interesting.
I think that's an interesting idea. I just don't necessarily know that even if that idea meshes with the core of Breath of the Wild being about complete freedom of exploration.
Sure.
I think Breath of the Wild was able to be the complete true open world that it was because there was no narrative for you to follow. You did not have to be taken anywhere. You could go wherever you wanted.
Yeah.
And so
even if I recall correctly, even experience story beats in essentially any order.
Yeah, and I think that was suited to Breath of the Wild's design philosophy. Mm-hmm. My concern would be, because you're totally right, it'd be very interesting to have a really story-heavy Zelda game, but we've gotten that in Skyward Sword, and people talk about Skyward Sword's controls and its dungeons. You know, there's a subject of people that talk about. Well, I think that's
because people don't complain about the narrative.
That's true, but even when the narrative is really foregrounded and important, that's not what the focus is.
Sure.
You know, sure, it's the character relationships.
I would say that is true, but because the narrative was fine or good, it was on par with the Twilight Princess and Wind Waker and everything, but this was the gimmick Zelda game where they had to focus on everything. So of course the draw is going to focus on what is very different about this game, which is those controls, and obviously that narrative is backgrounded because of that, and we sort of saw that resurface as we were experiencing Skyward Sword HD. I do think that you're right, is that a core narrative focused game does not really work with the game design philosophy of Breath of the Wild. Yeah. But it could work with the gameplay philosophy design of Breath of the Wild 2 if it is different. Open world games can have great stories in them. They can work with that format. Breath of the Wild wanted to take the impetus away from needing to follow a story, but it could easily be placed back on that in a way that I think could reframe the way you're exploring the world, could reframe the way you are making progression. That would make this a markedly different experience in an open world, presumably, but a markedly different experience of what you as a player are focusing on in a sequel to Breath of the Wild.
That's a really good point. I mean, something like a Red Dead Redemption 2 is heralded as one of the best narratives of all time in the context of an open world game.
I think a huge open world.
Yeah, but then I think the thing about that is Breath of the Wild's open world was special because it wasn't that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I feel like then the problem becomes, okay, if it's about the narrative, it's about shifting towards that more traditional open world format, well, then it's just another open world game. Mm-hmm. I just feel like you can't take the core of Breath of the Wild and retread it. Sure. But I also don't think you can take the core of Breath of the Wild and put it in the context of this sort of narrative-driven thing and keep why Breath of the Wild was special in the first place. Yeah, I just think it's a very narrow line to walk, but I just don't think either was really correct. You know, if you want to repurpose the Breath of the Wild engine, sure, I think it's a great engine. I think like those games are beautiful. But then I think you do that in the context of a traditional Zelda game if you want that heavier narrative focus. I just feel like they're trying to find some way to take Breath of the Wild and repurpose it, but they're repurposing it far too late, in my opinion.
Sure. No, that's a great point, and I think that there isn't really one who would argue with that. Is okay, this is repurposed Breath of the Wild. It is using the same engine. It is that direct sequel. Why didn't it come out years before? That's something that we may know eventually, but it kind of seems unlikely due to how not very transparent Nintendo is about their development history. So it's fascinating. This is a really interesting game, and for me, I think that enigma of it and the possibility of it inherently makes it very exciting. And not only that, it's been 5 years since the majority of us played Breath of the Wild.
Good point.
There could be a stepping out in the Great Plateau again, if only because it's been such a long time. Maybe the reason that they're waiting this long is because if you give it a little bit of a break, it is exciting to step out once again. People do replay Breath of the Wild, and of course not the exploration doesn't hit them to that same extent, but because they've already experienced that exact same world. But maybe 5 years later, stepping out into the sequel to the Great Plateau, you put into a new framework of a bigger story and a greater world and better traversal mechanics and different gameplay options, different combat, different characters. Maybe that is just as exciting in its own way. I think that there's a strong possibility that what we're missing here is, okay, maybe they actually can recapture that energy in a way that we're not necessarily expecting till we have it in our hands and can actually experience it.
No, I mean that's a really good point. Mario 3 is incredibly iterative upon Super Mario Brothers, but it was still a revelation by its own merit. So you're totally right that there could just be something we're completely missing. Mm-hmm. But it just feels like, for me, the entire Zelda series, with rare exception, usually on handheld, is not iterative. You know, it's just not an iterative series. It reuses formulaic elements and design tenets, but they're repurposed in completely different ways. Yeah, and there is a progression from, if you're talking about 3D Zelda, there's a progression, or even if any Zelda, from Zelda NES to 2 to Link to the Past to Ocarina to Majora to Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, Skyward Sword, Breath of the Wild. Mm-hmm. You can track a progression, but you can go back and play with any of those games, and they're all still amazing experiences that are their own. Mm-hmm. And so are we going to then, sure, make a bigger, better Breath of the Wild, but then what does that make Breath of the Wild? I think the success of the Zelda series is that it's episodic. Yeah. And I just don't want this game, I don't want the only other new Zelda game on Switch to just be more of the Zelda game we've already gotten, even if it is bigger and better than that.
That's a great point. But at this point, can't do anything about that.
That's too late.
I personally, from my perspective of trying not to worry about that kind of stuff, I wouldn't put any stress or stock in that. We're gonna get another Zelda game after this isn't the last game in the fucking Zelda series. But what I think is interesting about what you're talking about, of the Zelda series being basically not iterative at all and trying something new each time, and each game standing on their own as their own thing, in a twisted, sort of dark way, this is something new for the Zelda series. A direct sequel. They've never done that before. And I think that it could be really interesting for them to try that. We get those kind of direct sequels and follow-ups and stuff from most video game franchises. Zelda is uncommon in that it hard resets every time and tries something entirely new each time. It's very fresh and exciting because of that. But what if this is interesting? What if that makes this an interesting spin on the Zelda formula? What if this gives them a little more time to work in the same world and really flesh it out and make it really have no issues whatsoever? I think that there is a possibility that it not being new is what makes it new in a weird way, and I think that could actually be really interesting.
No, I mean, I think that's a great point, and it's kind of I do think it's happened already, though, if you include the handheld games, because that's basically what A Link Between Worlds was.
No, that's a
Link
great
to
point.
The Past, and A Link Between Worlds is great, but A Link Between Worlds was great for me because I played it before I played A Link to the Past, and you had the progression of playing that second, which in your mind completely obliterated A Link to the Past. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, even though it was a lot better, it is so close. I mean, that's basically the Breath of the Wild 2 situation. It's the same map. Mm-hmm. It's basically the same narrative construction. Yeah. With a different framework, but it's still the same effective experience.
Yes, no, for sure.
And that game was derided for being too similar to A Link to the Past. Mm-hmm. And especially because it had been so long before that, since the last traditional new Zelda game. Well, I guess it wasn't that long since Spirit Tracks, but Spirit Tracks, the DS ones are already what they are. Spin-offs, call them whatever you want to call them. But I just think that yes, you're totally right. There's going to be more Zelda games. It's too late to change this. But this entire thing is basically predicated just on where I'm coming from, not whether or not this is smart for the Zelda series as a whole, because it is. I will say that it is more. Making a sequel to Breath of the Wild is the smartest thing Nintendo could do with the Zelda series. Mm-hmm. But I just think that we didn't get Ocarina of Time 2. We got something markedly different.
Yeah.
not only did it come faster, but you're in Termina, the entire gameplay structure is completely different.
Yeah.
That is a time looping RPG almost, right?
Yeah.
And it's just like, this is an iterative sequel to Breath of the Wild isn't really what I want.
Yeah.
I suppose at the end of the day. And I don't think I don't think iteration is what's made Zelda special. It's what made A Link Between Worlds really good, but it didn't make that game very special.
Sure. No, that's a good point.
That's kind of where I come at it from.
No, I think everything that you're saying is totally reasonable. From both of our perspectives, it's a lot of future projecting. It's a lot of, we don't know fucking anything about this. We know a handful of concepts of what this idea of this game might be, but we don't know for sure. And hopefully this is I think the best case scenario is get a trailer at the Game Awards that does reveal the title and the release date window, if not the date, and a little bit more of, okay, what's the structure of this game going to be like? Personally, I would like it to have a different kind of structure of progression that does set it apart from that original, which I think would kind of wash away your problems with them trying to directly copy the same energy, which I don't think is unlikely considering the development time. And the fact that if we, again, reframe this of, yeah, they've done something different every single time. Okay, this time they're not doing something different, but what if it's more different than we're expecting, because the Zelda team does different things. Like, they've never done this before. This could be more different. We have no fucking way of knowing, but we will hopefully be playing it next year. I don't think you would disagree in saying that you're going to pick this up day one and play through it in 2 weeks.
I bought fucking Metopia. Of course I'm going to buy a Breath of the Wild sequel.
And all we can presume is that it would at least be a good game.
Well, again, I mean, I love Breath of the Wild. I think Breath of the Wild is in the top 5 games Nintendo has ever made. I think it's fucking amazing, you know? But you make a lot of strong points. I just want to leave you with a mental picture for a second, Tucker.
Uh-oh.
This
is like one of those pictures that we need viewer discretion advised.
Yes.
Do I need to turn the kids' eyes away from this fucking picture?
Yes, this is too erotic. This is never going to happen because Elden Ring is going to win most anticipated game of the year. Oops, I just dropped something. Sorry, audio listeners. But imagine this for a second.
We don't have audio listeners. We don't put this out on podcast servers.
Everybody's listening with their audio.
Not deaf people?
We need a sign language translator here at Backlog Banter.
Sure.
But imagine this, Tucker. The Game Awards card flips open. The winner of most anticipated game of the year, the sequel to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild 2. Entire stage goes black. Jeff Keighley goes, wait, what's this?
Link and Smash.
And it immediately is the trailer with the title for Breath of the Wild 2. And then he goes, oh, actually, the winner is actually Breath of the Wild. Link's opponent's, I don't know, somebody's big penis.
I think your hypothetical story.
See what I'm getting at?
No, of course, that's a phenomenal idea that requires a lot of coordination and lying and corruption at the top of the Game Awards and Nintendo to make happen. But it would be very fun. If I am creating this hypothetical scenario, I say Jeff opens the card and says the name to the game, and then we're like, what? That's what it's called? What? Boom! Trailer.
That makes more sense.
You gotta have a thinking brain.
What if he opens it up and there's a Willy Wonka's chocolate golden ticket in there,
and it transports him to Hyrule? Just fucking disappears, and we have to cancel the Keighley's because everyone has to go on a fucking Jeff Keighley manhunt.
What if Jeff Keighley strips down to his underwear and on his big belly he's got the name of the game written?
I just think you just skip the middleman and make it written on his ass.
I think it's on each knuckle.
That's presumably a lot of letters to fit on.
Yeah, it's in rows, but it's like what's the Spike Lee movie?
Do the Right Thing.
Which steals it from Night of the Hunter. You know what I'm talking about? Then wears on the knuckles.
Yeah, well, he says it is love and hate. That's not one word.
No, but this would be like 16 words. Like the Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild 2, Mipha, and Link had sex.
Go to town.
And then he has to just unfurl his fingers.
Jeff, hire us. I know your show is probably already completely planned at this point, but hire us.